We just marked the first anniversary of one of the most disastrous, catastrophic days for our country and our democracy, January 6th. Much has been written and said about that wretched day. We've all been reading and listening. There have been lots of important insights. And we heard, of course, about the profound concerns for the vulnerability of our democracy. I will not repeat all that has been said, but I would like to focus on just one aspect of this catastrophe, and this is summarized in this insight by Hannah Arendt in her monumental work published in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, that is the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, that is the standards of thought, no longer exist." Why have the lines between fact and fiction, true and false, become so blurred in our country? Why are so many prone to believe misinformation and outright lies? I believe we have made ourselves vulnerable because for a long time there has been a steady decline of thinking in our country. We have refused to think, to engage in critical thinking. We have refused to know, to search for truth. We have relinquished the mind, and not just last year or the 4 years before, but for a long time there has been an anti-thinking current in our country. The attitude has been, let others do the thinking, we will follow. Most people do not engage anymore in a meaningful exchange of ideas. There are no intelligent discussions. Most of us suffer from intellectual laziness. We don't pursue ideas. We follow ideologies, party lines. We are for this, against that. Why? We have no idea. We just follow passively. Last week, Felicia spoke about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. We had an exchange about this concept of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. There are 3 terms in the Torah that describe Pharaoh's heart's condition: Chazak, strong; Kashe, hard; and Kaved, heavy. In this parashot, we see Pharaoh desperately trying to remain a rock of strength and hold on to his power. He is obtuse, obstinate, impermeable. Pharaoh's heart is emotionally sealed off. He's impenetrable. He does not allow himself to feel, not the pain of his people, not the pain of the Israelite people. He shows a total lack of empathy. He doesn't want to know. The Torah defines or speaks about Pharaoh as someone who does not know. Lo yada et Yosef. He did not know Joseph, the Torah says. Lo yadati et Hashem. Who is Adonai that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know Adonai, nor will I let Israel go. I do not know. That's what characterizes Pharaoh. I do not know. Aviva Zornberg says that not knowing is the Egyptian disease. Not knowing is the Egyptian disease, the disease of insensitivity. Pharaoh's heart is strong, hard and heavy. Now, the heart is, of course, the place of emotions, but in biblical language, the heart is also the place of thinking, of discernment, the place where choices happen. Pharaoh's impermeability is not just emotional impermeability, it's also intellectual. He does not want to know, not just emotional, but also intellectually. He willfully shuts off his mind. Pharaoh makes his mind hard and impenetrable. He refuses to see, he refuses to reason, he refuses to see the truth that is before him. And one has to wonder, what is he so afraid of finding out if he allows himself to think and to know? Maybe he is afraid of confronting his own weakness. He feels so strong, but perhaps inside, deep inside, he knows he's weak and vulnerable. Perhaps that's why he doesn't want to know. He crashes once and again during the plagues until he destroys his country and ultimately self-destructs. In her book on Exodus, Aviva Zornberg brings the following quote by Jean-Paul Sartre. How can anyone choose to reason falsely? It is simply the old yearning for impermeability. There are people who are attracted by the permanence of stone. They would like to be solid and impenetrable. They do not want to change, for who knows what change might bring. It is as if their own existence were perpetually in suspense, but they want to exist in all ways at once and all in one instant. They have no wish to acquire ideas. They want them to be innate. They want to adopt a mode of life in which reasoning and the quest for truth play only a subordinate part, in which nothing is sought except what has already been found, in which one never becomes anything else but what one already was. Egypt represents the enslavement of the mind, not just the body. Our people were trapped in a place of no thinking, no reasoning, and no quest for truth. That's why the goal of the liberation from Egypt is precisely to know truth from false, right from wrong, fact from fiction, to know God, to know God's truth. That's why the culmination of the Exodus is not just going out and crossing the Red Sea. The culmination of the Exodus is the giving of the Torah. God took us out of Egypt in order to give us the Torah, in order that we might know and search for truth. Look at the Talmud. The Talmud is questions and discussions and searching and questing and knowing. There is no real freedom without knowing. There is one moment during the narrative of the Exodus, right before the final deadly plague. God is telling Moshe and Aaron to instruct the people what to do that night before they left. How to prepare the Passover offering, how to eat it, how to place the blood on the doorposts of the houses, and so on. And in the middle of those instructions, the Torah says, You shall observe this as an instruction or institution for all time, for you and your descendants. And when you enter the land that Adonai will give you, as God has promised, you shall observe this rite. והיה כי יאמרו עליכם בניכם, מה העבודה הזאת לכם? And when your children ask you, מה העבודה הזאת לכם? What do you mean by this ritual? You shall answer, it is the Passover sacrifice, and so on. We know the story from the Pesach Seder, from the Haggadah. In the middle of these instructions, suddenly, a question emerges. Ma, what? What is this ritual? Why are we doing this? Suddenly, in Egypt, in that place where the mind is sealed, there arises a question. Thinking begins with one question. In a culture of not knowing and not wanting to know, the question is audacious, subversive. It challenges, it probes, it breaks through. Those of us who grew up in authoritarian or dictatorships, authoritarian regimes or dictatorships, we knew that we couldn't ask too many questions. If you ask questions, you put your life at risk. In a culture that doesn't want to know, that suppresses knowledge and thinking, a question is audacious, subversive, it challenges, it probes, it breaks through. That's why it's dangerous. Aviva Zornberg says the ma question, what, ma question, tries to push to the limit of the known, the obvious. To ask what or why is not to ask for scientific definitions, but to probe the unknown, to insist on depths yet to be plumbed. Freedom comes only when the mind is unleashed. The purpose of the liberation from Mitzrayim is the freedom to ask in order to know. And the question is the beginning and the key to liberation. That's why in the middle of this narrative, in the middle of that night, a question arises. What? Ma ha'avodah azot lachem. In the middle of the text, what is this ritual? The central ritual of Pesach, which we do every year, the commemoration of our liberation, revolves around a question or several questions. Questioning and thinking lead to freedom. Towards the end of the Parashat, we have this interesting contrast. There are two verses, one next to the other. Chapter 13, verse 14 reads, V'haya ki shalcha bincha machar lemor ma zot. And when in time to come your son, your child asks you saying, what does this mean? The next verse, Vayehi ki iksha parot leshalchen. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go. Iksha parot leshalchen. So you have the question of the child. Next verse is the Pharaoh's iksha, kashe, hard, the hardened of his heart that prevented the people from going out. An interesting contrast. Hannah Arendt, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. I believe that what led to January 6th last year is the abdication of the mind. An abdication that was not forced by a totalitarian regime or a dictatorship, but an abdication of the mind that was the collective decision of a nation that chose to despise the mind and opted not to think. What are we afraid our thinking will reveal? What will it expose us to if we think too much? What is so intolerable that we decided to relinquish the mind? I believe we have led ourselves to believe with perfect and unquestionable faith in our American exceptionalism. We became infatuated with our great values, with our moral right, with our exemplary democracy, with the infallible strength of our institutions, to the point that we wanted to export democracy throughout the world. Perhaps we didn't want to know, because we didn't want to be exposed to the existence of so much imperfection in our system, so much vulnerability, to be exposed to so much complexity, how good and evil are intertwined at the core of our national being. So we took good and evil that are intertwined and we split it into two sides. Our side is totally good, the other side is totally evil. Everybody did this. There aren't two sides. It's all intertwined and mixed together. But it's hard to see. It's hard to see that with the good there's also so much evil. Perhaps we didn't want to know about the moral weaknesses, about the hatred and the intolerance. Perhaps we didn't want to experience the pain of coming face to face with our blemishes. We didn't want to experience the disappointment, the shame, the helplessness. And so we chose to shut the mind off and not to know. I think that together with our mourning for all the losses throughout the pandemic, we have been experiencing profound mourning for our country, particularly since last January 6th. We are mourning for all the things we didn't want to know. But there are no shortcuts to mourning. We can try to deny and repress and escape mourning, but sooner or later, it comes after us with a vengeance. Consolation will only come when we are able to face the truth. To come face to face with the truth. In order to do that, we must open our minds, to open our minds again and reclaim thinking. And if we open our minds, we will find strength. The truth strength that comes from questioning and knowing and looking at reality in the eye and engaging in the quest for truth. Consolation will come when we're willing to know the truth. Shabbat Shalom.